Okay, next up I'm going to install the wheel in the back of the frame. This has got a chain tensioner system on it, and I've already got the chain tensioner bolt installed in the threaded hole right in front of the dropout. That installs right there. Then you take the wheel and you slide it on like that. Now with this chain tensioner system, it comes with this fitting right here. It's a washer that's made to fit inside the dropout. It's got a raised surface right there, and then this top part acts as a washer, and this bolt presses on the front of this to slide it back to give tension to the chain. So it just slides on there like that, and you take the nut, spin it on there, and then once I have the chain installed onto the front sprocket and the freewheel, then I can slide it backwards wherever it needs to be to create tension. I can use this to hold that tension in place, then I just tighten the nuts and the back wheel's ready to go. Okay, now I'm going to install the front wheel. I've already taken the washer and the nut off of the axle, so all you need to do is roll the wheel back and install it onto the front fork. Now, as you can see, the front axle, there's a gap in between the dropout and the lock nut on both sides. The way you take care of that in a case like this is you have to install a spacer. Okay, this spacer is 5 millimeters thick, which is the exact amount that's on either side of the gap. So all you do is take the wheel, install the spacer, the washer, and the nut, leave it loose so you can get it back onto the front fork, and then position the fork dropout with the spacer on the inside of the dropout, the nut and the washer on the outside of the dropout. That's all there is to it. Repeat for both sides, tighten it up, and you're ready to go. Okay, the next step is to install the cranks, bottom bracket, front sprocket. There's a number of different components here. We've got the cranks themselves, we've got the bearings and cups, spacer that goes in between the bearings and cups, some small spacers to make sure the cranks are in the right position on the spindle. This is the spindle. Little trim pieces, and then the sprocket. And all of that installs right here in the bottom bracket. So I'm going to get some grease on some parts here, and I'll explain where all the grease is going and how everything goes together. Okay, now I'm going to install the bottom bracket and spindle. The components of the bottom bracket and spindle are the bearing cups with sealed bearings, spindle, and a spacer. So, the first thing you need to do is you need to slide the spindle into this cup, slide the spacer in place, and then the other cup. Now, the reason you do this is you want to measure between the inside edge here and here, and that measurement needs to be the same distance as from this side of the bottom bracket to the other side of the bottom bracket. That way when you tighten everything up, if this spacer is the correct length, it won't put unnecessary pressure on the bearings in the middle as you tighten the cranks on, and it won't bind up the bearings. Okay, I've already done that on mine. It came out of the box already the right size, so I don't have to do anything extra. If it were, say, not the right size, you can use shims to get the cups out further if you have to. In this case, I don't have to. Okay, so those are the parts. And again, you want to make sure that the threads in here are greased on both sides. That way, whenever you install the pieces, it makes it easier to install, and then it keeps the bottom bracket from making noises once it's all installed and you're using the bike. It won't squeak or make a bunch of racket. And also, if whenever you have to take the parts out for maintenance or replacement, it's a lot easier to unthread them when they've been greased, so it won't seize up in there. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install the cup and bearing on the left side of the bike. There's a lot of thread, so you got to twist for a while. Okay, so that one's in place, and again, that side is just like any normal thread. It's right to tighten it, left to loosen it. Then I want to make sure that I have a thin film of grease on the spindle. Install it through this bearing. Again, that keeps it from seizing up with the grease on there if you ever have to take it apart. Put the spacer in place. Slide it through so the spindle goes through the other bearing. And on this one, you turn it to the left to tighten it instead of to the right. So you spin that thing on there. And with the spindle and everything in place, it makes it a lot easier to start the threads, because you do not want to cross thread it, because if you do, it's ruined. It can be fixed, but it's never right once it's been stripped. So that's in place. Spindle's in place. Now all I have to do is take a wrench, tighten these down real snug, both sides, and then I'll be ready to install the crank. Okay, now I'm going to install the cranks. First thing you need to keep in mind is there's a left side and a right side. The left side is plain, smooth. The right side has an extra fitting, threaded fitting, for a bolt that helps hold the sprocket in place. I'll show you that in a minute. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you have a thin layer of grease, just like everything else, so parts don't stick if you have to take them apart later. Now, the non-drive side crank arm, the left side, I'm just going to slide it in place, and I'll show you in more detail whenever I do the drive side. But there's a spacer that goes on the left side. It's got a chamfered edge to it, so it looks, kind of cool. And it acts as a spacer between the crank arm and the bearing. Another thing to note is there is an angle to the crank. You want to make sure that angle is facing out. That way the crank doesn't hit the frame. So you take the spacer, slide it on the spindle, then you install the crank arm. There we go. That one kind of was tough to get on there. Okay, so we'll leave that. Alright, now the next part is installing the drive side. Now there's a couple of things to note about the drive side. The hole in the sprocket, and in a lot of sprockets, can be larger than the diameter of your spindle. Okay, see? That's not going to work. So they supply a special washer that reduces the size, so when you install it, you don't get a lot of wobble. Okay, so the spacer's in place. Then what I'm going to do, if you want your graphics to show, you got to make sure the graphic is out, your crank arm's out. Okay, I'm just going to put this on here like this. That fitting lines up with this hole. Okay, there's a bolt, it's got some Loctite on it so it doesn't come loose. That fits on there like that. And what that does is once everything's installed, keeps the sprocket from just spinning on the spindle. It's attached to the crank arm, so it's all together, so when you pedal, it actually works your chain. So get your appropriate sized hex Allen wrench. I'm going to tighten it on there, but I'm not going to tighten it all the way. I'm just going to tighten it to where it's kind of snug. And that Loctite will make it kind of stiff going on there. But that's okay because it will help keep it from slipping. So anyway, you have a little play there so you can line everything up. Then what you want to do is you want to make sure that your crank arms line up appropriately. So that one we'll put at the 12 o'clock position. This one needs to install at the 6 o'clock position, just like that. You slide it on there, and you make sure that your sprocket goes over that spacer. That way it's all nice and snug. And when you tighten everything down, you tighten the bolt on the back of the crank arm. It will hold this firmly in place. Then you take the crank arm bolts and make sure you got a little thin layer of grease on there for the same reasons as before. Keeps it from seizing up, and if you ever have to take it apart, makes it a lot easier. Then you thread that in there thusly. Do the same thing on the other side, and then use the appropriate sized Allen wrench, and you snug the whole thing together. One thing you want to make note of is you want to make sure that your spindle is centered between the two crank arms. That way when you have one tightened down and you tighten the other one down, you have space to where it's not bottomed out in there, so it's all nice and tight. Once you get all that tightened up, then you tighten the pinch bolt, and what that does is the pinch bolt crimps that even tighter around those spindles to keep it from wiggling and eventually messing up the splines on the inside of the crank arm and on the spindle. So all you do is just stick that in there, and it's got blue Loctite on it as well, so that way when you tighten it, it keeps it from backing out. And that's already got grease installed. That way we don't have to worry about it seizing up. Basically that's it. I'll tighten everything up and we'll be ready to move on to installing the chain.